We are Daniel chapter 7 this morning. Daniel chapter 7. If you have one of our Pew Bibles there, little blue Bibles, page 470. It'll keep you a little bit from searching around too much. Daniel chapter 7. In what was roughly the year 600 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Babylonian Empire, conquered a small nation by the name of Judah. He made Judah a vassal state, took lots of taxes, lots of money, and took a lot of its best and brightest young men away to Babylon to turn them into good Babylonians. These were young men who he envisioned and trained to be bureaucrats and functionaries and dignitaries within his government. Sometimes he would send them back to represent him in their homelands, and sometimes he kept them in Babylon, as was the case with Daniel. He was one of those guys. And we started off actually this year in the first half of the book of Daniel. And in the first 6 chapters, Daniel recounts various incidents in his life that he and his friends went through. And basically, what we said was they showed us how to live an undefeated life. Though they experienced some setbacks, certainly being dragged from your home as a slave for all intents and purposes, and taken to Babylon, that would be a setback. You could agree that being inducted into slavery would be a setback in your life, and whatever plans you had just went suddenly out the window. But they taught us how to live an undefeated life. And then we get to chapter 7, and the reason that we broke it up was because chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and then chapters 7 through 12 have very little similarity to each other than they have the same author. But chapters 1 through 6 are all these historical narratives, these things that took place in their lives. Chapters 7 through 12 are a series of visions that Daniel had that detailed the future. And now some of us, we're looking backwards now several thousand years, and so some of what he experienced as future prophecy is now ancient history for us, and some of it, as we'll see, is still future actually to us. And so, we're breaking it up to go these two different things together. But as we wrapped up 2 Peter a couple weeks ago, you'll remember we finished our study through the book of 2 Peter, and Peter made this kind of a great analogy. We kind of summed it up this way. And we said that learning about the future causes you to look for it. Looking for the future causes you to live for it. And living for the future causes you to love it. And we kind of put that together. And heading into the second half of Daniel, this is where we begin or commence learning about the future. Because that's what Daniel is here to tell us largely about, is what's coming next. And his scale is, the scope of all of these prophecies are just intense. They're very long. And so Daniel chapter 7 starts us on that path of, here is what's coming, as was revealed to Daniel. And like I said, you'll see what parts of it were now history to us and what part lays ahead. But he begins in Daniel chapter 7 and verse 1 with the setting. So we get a sense of where he is. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while on his bed. Then he wrote down the dream, telling the main facts. And so Daniel introduces to him. It's interesting that here this is in third person kind of, even though this is him writing. And we find this, he's in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. And so we can date this to about where we are. Daniel is roughly 50 years old. As we introduce to him here, this is actually about it's the early part of Belshazzar. Now Belshazzar takes us back to Daniel chapter 5. He was the king who got the handwriting on the wall, that whole message. That was him a little bit later in his reign, and so we're here kind of as Daniel's time in Babylon is almost going to begin to end as he transitions to Persia, but still very Babylonian. And he's here with Belshazzar, and he's introduced to this vision that he receives. And the vision and the interpretation of the vision really take up the bulk of the chapter from about verse 2 all the way to about verse 27. Now, what I'm going to do this morning is we're not going to read all 25 of those verses, but I'm just going to read a few things here and there. But but share both the vision and the interpretation at the same time. Does that make sense, so we don't lose it along the way? But he had this great vision of these four beasts that emerged from the sea of humanity. Look what he said in verse 2. Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea being there the sea of humanity. And four great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. And so this vision is about these four great beasts. Now, the first beast that Daniel sees coming up is this lion with eagle's wings. And this particular beast represents for us the empire that was Babylon. This is depicting Babylon. It's interesting as we have excavated, and archaeology comes into play on some of these things as well, but archaeologists have found statues of winged lions, which are believed to have been representative of Babylon itself. And so this particular imagery is lifted right out of Daniel. Could have looked around him and seen lions with eagle's wings, and it was very clear to him that it would have been Babylon. Secondly, then, he sees another beast emerge, and this is a beast that is a bear with three ribs in its mouth, and one side is larger than the other. This particular beast represents the Medo-Persian Empire, the empire of Media and Persia. The two sides uneven because the Median kingdom kind of rose first. The Persian Empire, or the Persian kingdom, rose second and became the dominant force in this Persia that was Medo-Persian. So you have this combined kingdoms work together to form this empire. This particular bear, it's interesting, is pictured with three ribs in its mouth. Now, other than sounding like you found a great place to go for lunch, those of you who are hungry will appreciate the barbecue reference maybe, but he has these three ribs sticking out of his mouth, and it's generally regarded that these ribs represent the three great conquests of the Persian Empire. In case you're wondering, that was Babylon in 539 BC that they defeated, the kingdom of Lydia in 546 BC, and the kingdom of Egypt in 525 BC as Persia wrapped up its dominance of the ancient world. And so you have this empire. Now, in Daniel's day, the kingdoms of Media and Persia, this Medo-Persian empire, was in its kind of beginning of its ascendancy. It would not be very much longer in Daniel's life and in Belshazzar's reign that the kingdoms, the kings of the Medes and Persians would begin their assault on the Fertile Crescent, on the ancient world. And it was not that many years hence that Nabonidus, Belshazzar's father, would experience great defeat and would run off to hide the rest of his life in the desert. And it wouldn't be that much longer before Belshazzar himself is killed, and Daniel, in the last few days of the empire, becomes co-regent and actually surrenders the empire, the Babylonian Empire, to the Persian Empire. So Daniel plays very key historical moments, but none of that has happened yet. And so he's looking at this great bear of an empire that is beginning to lumber across the world stage in his day. And then he goes on to say that a leopard emerged, the leopard having four wings on its back and four heads. Now, this particular animal represents for us the Greek Empire, and this was still very far off that the Greek Empire would come. The Greek Empire was fast. It was like a leopard in many respects. Alexander the Great invaded Asia Minor in the year 334 BC, and within 10 years had conquered the entire Persian Empire all the way to India. And legend has it that after 10 years of constant warfare, after 10 years of brutalizing the largest empire on the earth in its day and establishing his own empire, it took him 10 years, and at the end of 10 years, he wept as he faced the subcontinent of India, saying there was no place left to conquer. I mean, here was a guy who traveled with cartographers, and they drew the map as they went because it hadn't been drawn yet. And that was his lament, that it had just happened so quickly. We think 10 years is like a lifetime. You imagine being engaged in any war for 10 years. But in that day, 10 years to conquer the entire known world was a relatively short time span, very fast. And so you have that leopard-like movement. But then you also have four heads. And a lot of times you read about heads and horns and things like that in prophecy. And typically they represent kings. And sure enough, Alexander's kingdom, once he secured it upon his death, was divided in 4 different ways. There was a lot of struggle that was there among his generals, but eventually 4 of them emerged and divided the Greek Empire into 4 areas. You have Antipater, who gained control of Greece and Macedonia, Lysimachus ruling in Thrace and Asia Minor, Seleucus governing Syria and Babylon and much of the Middle East, and then Ptolemy, who we probably know best, controlling Egypt and Palestine. And so you have the Greek Empire with these 4 heads, exactly the way that Daniel had seen this 4-headed beast emerging from the great sea of humanity. And then he says, finally, another beast emerged. And this other beast defied classification. He saw something that he could not wrap his head around to say, it looks like this. It was this massive beast. It was different than the 3 beasts who had come before. It was violent. It was huge. It was brutal. It had, bronze nails and claws, and it just literally stomped over everything in its path, and it was very different. And this particular beast represents for us the Roman Empire, because it was different, just as it was prophesied. It was different than all of the empires that had come before. It was more brutal than the empires had come before. It was larger than the empires that had come before, and it lasted longer than the empires that had come before it. And so it was very much a different beast that Daniel was seeing here. And so you have these 4 beasts emerging. And then interestingly, and you could say this was part of the 4th beast, but it almost warrants breaking it out for himself, because that 4th beast, he was looking at it, and the 4th beast had 10 horns. Had these 10 horns. And now this is the part where for us we move from history to prophecy. Because all of this, we know about the Babylonian Empire, that's ancient history. We know about the Medo-Persian Empire, it's ancient history. We know about the Greek Empire, it's ancient history. We know about the Roman Empire, it's ancient history. But he says here that out of the ashes, out of the whatever was of the Roman Empire, these 10 horns are going to emerge. This has not happened yet. You say, when is it going to happen? I have no idea. We're going to do our best to walk through what we see here. But 10 horns are going to emerge, 10 horns representing 10 kingdoms and 10 kings that are going to emerge out of the old Roman Empire. You say, how's that happen? How's that work? I have no idea. I'm just telling you what's here. And he said, and then as he watched, another small horn appeared as well. Another little horn appeared, and it had eyes and a mouth. And with its eyes, it was able to see and gain intelligence, and with his mouth, it was able to spew obscenities toward God and men. And this little horn that emerged later was not like the other horns, and it actually knocked down or uprooted 3 of the horns. And so what we see here is out of these 10 kingdoms that are going to emerge out of what was once the Roman Empire, another is going to emerge who's going to overrun 3 of those kingdoms and secure his reign over the whole earth. This little one that emerges, we do know who that is. That is the Antichrist. We see him prophesied throughout Daniel, through Revelation, through the minor prophets, throughout much of the Bible. He's going to emerge in the very last times as this force who, just like his name says, is against Christ, against God, against all that is godly. And he's going to be the last gasp effort of the devil to secure this world for his own dominion. And so the Antichrist is going to emerge, and he's going to gain intelligence, and he's going to gain an empire and a kingdom, and he's going to spew out obscenities. And then the scene kind of shifts when we get to the end here. He says, after this whole thing went on, that he saw the Ancient of Days. That he was sitting there, and all of a sudden, this throne wheels in. And sitting on this throne is the Ancient of Days, and flowing from this throne is fire flowing out among the nations in judgment. And the Ancient of Days is sitting there, and suddenly he says the Son of Man comes, and the Son of Man is awarded. We look at this all the way down into, we can see it in verse 13 and verse 14. Let's see, I've skipped over a couple reading things, so let me catch up here. Look what he says in verse 13. I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, and all the peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion. And what we see here in this Son of Man, any question as to who that might be? We see him listed throughout the Gospels for us, calling himself even the Son of Man. We find this is Jesus, the Ancient of Days, being God the Father, seated on his throne. And Jesus is brought before the throne, and God awards him, bestows upon him the kingdoms of the earth to rule and to reign. So we see Jesus actually installed as king, and we see him ruling over the entire earth and all the nations bowing before him. And his kingdom, unlike all the other kingdoms, is going to be an everlasting kingdom. We think about, and we've talked about a little bit from time to time, the millennial kingdom of Jesus, that 1,000 years where Jesus is going to rule and reign as king physically on this earth, and what a great golden era our world is going to experience, more than it has ever known before. And then at the end of that period, the devil's going to be loosed for just a minute. He's going to raise an army. There's going to be one last great bloodbath of rebellion. And then we move into the eternal state where Jesus continues to rule as king over all of creation. And so his kingdom, is truly an everlasting kingdom. But it's not the only thing that's going on there. If we were to skip ahead to verse 27, then the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heavens shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. And it's interesting here that this, you find in these two places, you see Jesus is installed as the king, and yet what we see is the kingdom being given to the people, to the saints. Who's that? Those are the ones who follow Jesus. That's you and I. That's those who have been born again, from all the way from Adam all the way through the end of whoever the last guy is. But everybody who has been a follower of Jesus, who has believed in him, who has received the gift of salvation that God has, those are the ones who are going to be inheriting that kingdom. Now that particular point is very important because of what happens with the Antichrist and the little horn. If we were to back up a few verses, we would find this about the little horn in verse 25. He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time. And what we find here is this reference, and we'll talk more about this as we go on, this reference to this tribulation period, this 7-year period that this little horn rules. And it's going to be a time of intense tribulation and an intense destruction. An immense amount of death is going to happen during this time. But during this time, what we find is this little horn, the Antichrist, is going to be persecuting the saints, and the saints are going to be given to him. He is actually going to be allowed, be permitted to persecute as much as he wants the children of God. You say, wow, that sounds brutal, doesn't it? That sounds wrong. It sounds horrible. It sounds a little bit like today. One of the things that's interesting to me as an American is, we live in a time that, and we bemoan it because it's increasingly ungodly. Have you noticed that? I just look around a little bit, and it seems like the world doesn't have much use for God anymore. Much cause for misuse, abuse. They don't like God. They hate Jesus. And those who would be followers of Christ seems like the one people group you are allowed to target. You notice that? You can't target ethnicities, and you can't target moral groups, and you can't target religious groups, but Christians, yeah, they're fair game. We go ahead and we'll just take them to task every chance we get. You ever feel that way, like the entire world is against you? That's probably because it largely is. And the funny thing is, of course, as Americans, and if you read a lot of stuff in the church and a lot of stuff that Christians are saying, as Americans, we're like, oh, Jesus must be coming back soon because look at how the world is treating Christians. The world's been treating Christians like that all over the world for a long time. It's just now coming home here to America, and all of a sudden it's becoming very real for us. But the Apostle John said in his epistle in 1 John that that the Antichrist would come, and the spirit of Antichrist was here already. That there is already rampant among our world and among our culture and among our society, and things that you will experience, that people who are wanting and desiring and able to persecute Christians solely for the fact that they're Christians. In the same way that eventually the Antichrist is going to be able to persecute Christians. And sometimes we feel already like we're given into their hands. Because it's like, what are you going to do? How do you defend yourself? What are you going to say that's going to turn the tide? And we feel this almost oppression. But what we find here at the end of Daniel chapter 7 is not only is Jesus going to be installed as king, the kingdom is going to be given over to his followers. That suddenly we are going to be the majority. Suddenly we are going to be the influencers, the movers, the shakers. We are going to receive the reward just the same as Jesus. We don't get to rule and to reign, but we get to rule and reign with him. And so we get this great, fantastic promise, which is good news. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, it's not like good news for tomorrow, but it's good news. And you ever get enough bad news that you're like, I'll take it? And that's kind of where we are. As we look at Daniel chapter 7, if you were to read back and you look back to Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar, the king, had this great vision, if you'll remember in Daniel chapter 2, of the statue. Before he built the statue of himself, he saw this great statue. Remember, it had a head of gold and a chest of silver, and then a bronze, and then finally iron mingled with clay at the bottom. And there's a real similarity between these two prophecies. They represent the same series of kingdoms. The Babylonian Empire, then the Persian Empire, and then the Greek Empire, and finally the Roman Empire, and then finally Jesus' empire that's going to obliterate it all. The difference between them, I think, is a matter of perspective. You look at chapter 2, and you see the kingdoms of this world in many respects how people see them from a very human perspective. We see fine metals, we see great power, we see great wealth. And then in chapter 7, we see these kingdoms, I think, as God sees them, as vicious beasts who destroy the people around them. It's interesting, the perspective shift. Where we see wealth and power, God sees death and destruction, wickedness. But he puts them all together into this one prophecy to give us really, I think, what was an important promise. And we see at the end here, last verse here in verse 28. Look at Daniel's response to the vision. And this may or may not be the response that you have, but he says, "This is the end of the account. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly troubled me, and my countenance changed, but I kept the matter in my heart." Daniel, as he saw this prophecy unfold, and as he received the interpretation of the prophecy, was greatly troubled by it. By what it heralded for the people of God and the followers of God. And sometimes we look at this prophecy and we see doom and gloom and we say, wow, there is trouble brewing, there is trouble on the horizon, there is trouble already starting to come into our lives as believers. And our temptation is to say, wow, we're just going to, it's like we're lambs to the slaughter, like we're just going to get beaten, that's all there is to it. And our temptation is to be troubled in the same way that Daniel was. But the reality is we do not need to be troubled. Because this vision graphically prophesies the fulfillment of the promise that Jesus made. Once upon a time, Jesus, very early in his ministry, sat down on a mountain to teach some people. And he gave this lengthy message, very diverse message. I tend to think of the Sermon on the Mount. You've heard me call it his manifesto, because it very much is. This is how my kingdom should be ordered. This is how my followers should live. In this great Sermon on the Mount, Jesus made this promise to his followers, and we see very visually, very graphically, this promise fulfilled in Daniel's vision here. But it was in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 5. Jesus simply said this, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And it's this almost cryptic blessing that those who are strong enough to be under control, those who are his followers, who are going to be maligned and beaten and abused, he said there's a blessing there because they will inherit the earth. And what do we find in Daniel chapter 7? The end of it all. Jesus will be king, and his followers, the kingdom, will be given to them. When Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth," it wasn't a metaphor. It was an absolute literal promise. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. We get it all. And so we don't need to be troubled, because it doesn't mean tomorrow is going to be any better. It doesn't mean, whatever happens with this election is going to be any better. It doesn't mean that over the next several years that suddenly this anti-God sentiment is going to reverse itself. I think it's going to intensify. I think that we are going to become increasingly ostracized and increasingly persecuted, even in America. I think it's going that way. But it's okay. Because the blessing is we will inherit the earth. And so I'd say buckle up. It's going to be a bumpy ride, but it's no reason to jump out of the car. Because where this one is going is to a great promise where Jesus is king and the kingdom, the entire earth, we inherit it for real. Does that make it easier to survive the rest? I don't know if it makes it easier to survive the rest, but it makes it doable. It makes it something where we can say, you know what, I can endure persecution. I don't like it. I think if you enjoy persecution, there's something wrong with you. You've got to screw loose someplace, because nobody likes to be beat down. Nobody likes to be insulted. Nobody likes to be picked on. Certainly nobody likes to suffer physically, emotionally, mentally, financially. These are not things that are pleasant. But the promise that is very visually fulfilled for us in Daniel 7 is that at the end of all of that, we really will inherit the earth. It makes it doable. So when you read Daniel chapter 7, and I'd encourage you, read through it. We skipped over a lot of stuff in here. I'd encourage you to read through it. One of the things that I found incredibly helpful actually was to get an audio Bible and listen to it. Because there's something intimidating about these 28 verses, and really all the prophecies here. You read them and you're like, your mind starts to turn to goo, and you're like, what? And you begin to drool. I get all that. But if you find a good audio Bible that'll read it for you, it's actually very instructive, very helpful to hear as you go. And so, but as you hear it, as you read it, don't become discouraged by the doom and the gloom, and certainly don't get lost in all of the beasts running around that you've never seen before. Hopefully there's enough here that you can remember what they are. But what I want you to see as you read through it is just an encouragement. The meek will inherit the earth. Father, I love you. I thank you for your word this morning. Lord, there's just so much here that it's hard to get through it all. But Father, we do live in a land, we do live in a time where we are increasingly unpopular because you are increasingly unpopular. Father, we face the very real prospect in our future of persecution. Lord, help us not to despair. Help us not to grow cold toward you. But help us to see, as Daniel saw, that at the end of all of the tribulation, at the end of all the persecution, at the end of all of the suffering that we might endure, is a blessing that is very real, as our Savior inherits the earth as King, and we inherit the earth as His followers. Lord, may the future be something we learn about. And as we learn about it, may we begin to look forward to that day. As we look forward to that day, may we begin to live for that day. And as we live for that day, help us to love it more and more. Thank you in Jesus' good name.